The first thing Victor noticed when they crossed the perimeter was the silence. Not the absence of sound, exactly, but the absence of the right sounds. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind through abandoned buildings and the steady crunch of their boots on cracked asphalt. "Camera's already showing grain," Alexei muttered beside him, adjusting the vintage digital device hanging from his neck. "We're not even at the city center yet." Victor checked his own Geiger counter, the yellow plastic device clipped to his chest rig. The needle sat comfortably in the green zone, occasionally twitching toward yellow. Normal background radiation for the outer zones. Nothing to worry about yet. They had at least 6 hours before their accumulated dose would require them to turn back. The city of Pripyat 9 hadn't officially existed for 20 years. After the incident, the government had sealed it, erected the containment walls, and scrubbed it from maps. But the Stalkers knew. They always knew. And where there was mystery, there was money. The collector who'd hired them had offered 15,000 euros for footage of the city center, particularly the old research facility where it had happened. Neither Victor nor Alexei had asked what it was. Stalkers who asked too many questions didn't stay stalkers for long. They moved through the outer residential district, past apartment blocks with empty windows like hollow eyes. Red vegetation had claimed everything, not the green of normal plant life returning to reclaim human spaces, but a deep crimson that seemed wrong somehow. The vines that crawled up concrete walls were the color of dried blood. The moss that carpeted the streets looked like raw meat in the afternoon light. "You seeing this, Flora?" Alexei whispered, though there was no one to hear them. "I've been in the zone before. Never seen anything like this." Victor had noticed it too. In his 5 years of illegal expeditions into quarantine territories, he'd seen plenty of mutations. 3-headed fish in cooling ponds, trees growing in impossible spirals. But this was different. This felt intentional somehow, as if the vegetation had chosen this color. They paused at an intersection where a bus had been abandoned mid-route, its tires long since rotted away, the vehicle's frame settling into the earth. Victor raised his fist, signaling a stop. His Geiger counter's clicking had increased, the needle dancing between green and yellow. "Check your dosimeter," he said. Alexei glanced at the device on his wrist. 0.8 microsieverts per hour. We're good. They were good, for now. Victor had memorized the exposure charts before they'd left. They could sustain this level for hours before needing to evacuate. But the radiation here was unpredictable. The briefing documents they'd obtained from their black market contact had warned them about hotspots, pockets of intense radiation that could appear anywhere, invisible killers that would cook them from the inside before they even knew they'd been exposed. As they moved deeper into the city, Victor began to notice the shadows. They were burned into the walls of buildings, dark silhouettes of people caught in whatever had happened here 2 decades ago. He'd seen similar shadows in photographs from Hiroshima, where the thermal radiation from the atomic bomb had been so intense it had permanently bleached the surrounding surfaces, leaving only the shadows of vaporized victims behind. But these shadows were different. Victor stopped in front of a concrete wall where 3 figures were etched in dark relief. A woman with her arms raised, as if shielding her face. A child reaching upward, a man running. The detail was extraordinary. He could see the folds in their clothing, the individual fingers on their hands. "The flash shadows," Alexei breathed, raising his camera. "The collector will pay extra for these." Victor's mouth tasted like metal. It was a common symptom of radiation exposure, he knew. The ionizing particles interacting with the metal fillings in his teeth, creating a galvanic reaction. He worked his jaw, trying to clear the taste. "Take your shots and let's keep moving," he said. "I want to reach the facility before dark." Alexei moved along the wall, photographing each shadow. Victor watched him work, trying to ignore the growing unease in his gut. Something about the shadows bothered him, though he couldn't articulate what. They continued through the city as the afternoon light began to slant golden through the empty windows. The Geiger counter maintained its steady clicking, a rhythmic companion to their footsteps. Victor had learned to read its voice like a language. The slow, intermittent clicks meant safety. Faster clicking meant caution. A rapid chatter meant run. Right now, it was speaking in measured tones, Caution, it said. Pay attention, but don't panic. The research facility rose before them as they entered the city center, a massive concrete structure that had once been painted white but now wore a coat of rust stains and crimson vegetation. The windows on the lower floors had been sealed with steel plates. The upper floors gaped open to the sky. Victor checked his watch. 4 hours until sunset. They had time. The metallic taste in his mouth had grown stronger. He took a pull from his water bottle, but it didn't help. Beside him, Alexei was reviewing his camera footage, and Victor could see the grain that had appeared in the images. It looked like static, as if reality itself was degrading. "Film's getting worse," Alexei said. "Digital sensors aren't supposed to do this. It's like the radiation is corrupting the data directly." "Can you still get usable footage?" "For now, but if it gets much worse, we'll just have noise." They approached the facility's main entrance, a set of heavy steel doors that hung open at crooked angles. Someone had been here before them. Recently too, judging by the fresh scratches on the concrete where the doors had been forced open. Victor's hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his hip. They weren't alone in the zone. Other stalkers, government patrols, or worse. There were stories about the people who'd stayed behind after the evacuation, who'd refused to leave their homes. Stories about what the radiation had done to them over the years. Inside, the facility was dark and smelled of rust and decay. Their flashlight beams cut through the gloom, illuminating hallways lined with abandoned equipment, papers scattered across the floor, their text faded to illegibility, toppled filing cabinets, broken glass crunching beneath their boots. The Geiger counter's clicking increased, still in the yellow zone, but climbing. They moved through a series of laboratories, past workbenches covered in dust and strange crystalline formations that had grown in the damp air. Alexei photographed everything, his camera's flash creating brief moments of stark illumination that somehow made the darkness feel heavier. In one room, they found a shadow on the floor instead of a wall. A person lying down, arms and legs spread, as if they'd been making a snow angel when the flash came. The detail was perfect. Victor could see the individual strands of hair splayed around the head, the creases in the clothing. "This doesn't make sense," Alexei said, kneeling beside the shadow with his camera. "Thermal shadows are created by intense heat and light, like a nuclear detonation. But there's no blast damage here, no thermal scoring. The building is intact." Victor had noticed the same thing. Whatever had created these shadows, it hadn't been a conventional explosion. "The collector said there was an incident at a research facility," Victor said. "Maybe they were working on something new, some kind of directed radiation weapon. That would explain the shadows, but not the colors, not the vegetation." They continued deeper into the facility, descending a stairwell into the basement levels. The air grew colder, damper. The metallic taste in Victor's mouth was now accompanied by a faint nausea. His dosimeter read 1.2 microsieverts per hour. Still safe, but they were accumulating dose faster now. The Geiger counter chattered more urgently, its clicking rhythm accelerating. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a heavy security door standing open. Beyond it, a corridor stretched into darkness, lined with more steel doors, each marked with faded Cyrillic text. "Containment Room 1, Containment Room 2, Containment Room 3. "This is it," Alexei whispered. "This is where they kept whatever they were working on." Victor checked his watch. 2 hours until sunset. They were pushing their time limit, but they'd come too far to turn back now. They moved down the corridor, checking each containment room. Most were empty, stripped clean of equipment. But in Containment Room 7, they found something. The room was circular, about 20 meters across, with walls made of thick concrete. In the center stood a metal pedestal, and on the pedestal sat a small cylindrical container, about the size of a thermos, made of what looked like lead glass. Inside the container, something glowed with a faint blue light. Victor's Geiger counter screamed. The needles slammed into the red zone, and the clicking became a continuous roar. "Out!" Victor shouted, grabbing Alexei's shoulder. "Now!" They stumbled backward into the corridor, and the clicking subsided to a frantic chatter. Victor checked his dosimeter, 3 microsieverts per hour. They'd just absorbed a significant dose in those few seconds. "Did you get footage?" Victor asked. Alexei checked his camera, his hands shaking. Yes, but it's almost pure grain. You can barely make out the container. Good enough. We're leaving. They retraced their steps through the basement, up the stairs, back through the laboratories. Victor's mind raced. Whatever was in that container, it was hot. Dangerously hot. The kind of radiation source that should have required massive shielding and remote handling. But it had been sitting there, exposed for 20 years. As they moved through the ground floor, Victor noticed something that made him stop. They were passing the same room where they'd photographed the shadow on the floor, the person making a snow angel. But the shadow was different now. The arms had moved. They were no longer spread wide but pulled in close to the body, as if the person was hugging themselves. "Alexei," Victor said quietly, "look at the shadow." Alexei turned, raising his camera. He stared at the shadow for a long moment, then slowly lowered the camera. "That's not possible," he said. "I photographed it an hour ago. The arms were spread out." "I know." They stood in silence, listening to the steady clicking of their Geiger counters. The metallic taste in Victor's mouth had become overwhelming. He spat on the floor and saw his saliva was tinged with red. "We need to leave," he said. "Right now." They moved faster now, no longer pausing to photograph or investigate. Victor's unease had transformed into genuine fear. The shadows were moving. Somehow, impossibly, the shadows burned into the walls and floors were changing position. As they passed through the facility's entrance hall, Victor saw another shadow on the wall, a man with his arms raised as if surrendering. But Victor remembered this shadow from when they'd entered. The man's arms had been at his sides then. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that matched the crimson vegetation. They moved quickly through the streets, retracing their route toward the perimeter. Victor's Geiger counter maintained its steady clicking, and he found himself focusing on that sound, using it as an anchor to reality. They were passing through the residential district when Alexei stopped. "Victor," he said. "The wall." Victor turned to look at the concrete wall where they'd first photographed the flash shadows. The woman with raised arms, the child reaching upward, the running man. The shadows had moved. The woman's arms were now at her sides. The child was standing still. The man was no longer running but standing, facing directly toward them. "This isn't radiation," Alexei whispered. "This is something else." Victor pulled out the briefing documents, scanning them by flashlight. There had been a section about anomalous phenomena, warnings about perceptual distortions and psychological effects. He found the passage and read it aloud. Reports from the initial containment teams described visual hallucinations, temporal distortions, and feelings of being watched. Personnel experiencing these symptoms were immediately evacuated and placed under observation. 3 subjects reported seeing shadows move independently of light sources. These reports were classified as stress-induced hallucinations resulting from radiation exposure. "Hallucinations," Alexei said. "You think we're hallucinating? Check your dosimeter." Alexei looked at his wrist. 2.1 microsieverts per hour. We're under our exposure limit. They continued walking, faster now. The clicking of their Geiger counters provided a constant soundtrack, a reminder that the real danger was invisible. Radiation didn't care about fear or courage. It simply was, penetrating their bodies, ionizing their cells, leaving damage that might not manifest for years. The perimeter fence appeared ahead of them, and Victor felt a surge of relief. They'd made it. Whatever was happening in Pripyat 9, they were leaving it behind. But as they approached the fence, Victor noticed the shadows again. They were everywhere now, burned into every surface, and they were all facing the same direction, facing them. "Do you see it?" Alexei asked. "They're all looking at us." Victor did see it. Dozens of shadows, maybe hundreds, all oriented toward their position. Some on walls, some on the ground, some on the sides of abandoned vehicles, all of them watching. His Geiger counter's clicking changed pitch, becoming faster, more urgent. He checked the display. 5 microsieverts per hour. That wasn't right. They'd been moving away from the facility, away from the hot zones. The radiation should have been decreasing, not increasing. "Run," Victor said. They ran. The clicking of their Geiger counters accelerated, becoming a frantic chatter. 6 microsieverts. 7, 8. The needles were climbing into the red zone, and Victor could feel it now. A warmth spreading through his body. his skin tingling, the metallic taste in his mouth so strong he could barely breathe. They reached the fence and scrambled over it, dropping down on the other side. Victor checked his dosimeter. 10 microsieverts per hour. They just absorbed a massive dose in the span of minutes. "We need to get to the decontamination point," Victor said. "The truck is 2 kilometers east." They stumbled through the forest, following the path they'd marked on their way in. The clicking of their Geiger counters continued its frantic rhythm. 11 microsieverts. 12. 15. "This doesn't make sense," Alexei gasped, leaning against a tree. "We're outside the contamination zone. The radiation should be dropping." Victor pulled out his own dosimeter to compare readings. The display showed the same impossible numbers: 20 microsieverts per hour, 30, 40. And then he understood. The radiation wasn't coming from the environment. It was coming from something nearby, something that was following them. He turned slowly, sweeping his flashlight beam across the darkening forest. The clicking of his Geiger counter had become a continuous roar, the needle pinned at maximum. "Alexei," he said quietly, "check your camera, the last few frames." With shaking hands, Alexei raised his camera and scrolled through the most recent images. The grain had become so severe that the photos were almost unrecognizable. Almost. But in the last image, taken just moments ago as they'd fled through the facility, something was visible in the background. A shadow, but not burned into a surface, standing free. A human silhouette that cast no shadow of its own, darker than the darkness around it. Victor's Geiger counter clicked faster, the sound blurring into a single sustained tone. 50 microsieverts, 60, 70. They were being exposed to lethal doses of radiation, but there was no source, no contamination, just the empty forest and the gathering dark. Alexei lowered the camera and looked at Victor. His nose was bleeding, so was Victor's. The radiation was cooking them, destroying their cells, turning their bodies against themselves. "It's behind you," Alexei whispered. "Don't turn around." But Victor did turn around. He couldn't help himself. And there, standing in the forest just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam, was the shadow. It was human-shaped but wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs slightly too long. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply stood there. And Victor understood with crystalline clarity that this was what had been in the facility. Not the glowing container. That had just been the cage. This was what had escaped 20 years ago. This was what had created the flash shadows, burning them into the surfaces of the city as it passed. And now it had found them. Victor's Geiger counter climbed to 80 microsieverts, 90, 100, lethal doses. Doses that would kill them in hours, if not minutes. The metallic taste in his mouth was overwhelming, and he could feel his skin burning, his eyes watering, his body beginning to shut down. And then, impossibly, the clicking stopped. Not slowed, not decreased, stopped completely. Victor looked down at his Geiger counter. The needle had dropped to 0, no radiation detected. He tapped the device, thinking it had malfunctioned. But no, it was working. The LED display was active. The battery was charged. It simply wasn't detecting any radiation. Beside him, Alexei's Geiger counter had also gone silent. "What's happening?" Alexei whispered. Victor understood. The shadow wasn't emitting radiation. It was absorbing it. Every particle, every photon, every stray emission from the contaminated forest around them. It was pulling radiation into itself like a black hole. And now that it was close, now that it was standing directly behind them, their Geiger counters had nothing left to detect. They were in the eye of a storm. A perfect sphere of zero radiation, with death standing at its center. Victor tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. The radiation damage was too severe. He collapsed to his knees, and Alexei fell beside him. The shadow stepped closer, and Victor could feel the heat of it, the terrible presence of something that should not exist. His camera. Alexei's camera was still recording. With the last of his strength, Victor reached out and pressed the record button, pointing the lens at the shadow. Let the collector have his footage. Let someone know what they'd found here. The shadow reached out with one impossibly long arm, and Victor saw that it had no features, no face, just a void in the shape of a person, darker than the surrounding darkness. Its hand touched his shoulder, and Victor felt the radiation flooding back into his body, no longer absorbed but released. The Geiger counter screamed back to life, clicking so fast it became a single sustained shriek. 200 microsieverts, 300, 400. Victor's vision blurred. He was dimly aware of Alexei beside him, convulsing as his body was cooked from the inside. The shadow leaned closer, and Victor saw his own reflection in its surface. Or not his reflection, his shadow. His shadow moving independently, reaching out, becoming part of the thing that stood before him. The last thing Victor heard before consciousness fled was the sound of his Geiger counter clicking. Not the frantic scream of moments before, but a slow, measured rhythm. Counting down, marking time, recording his final moments in beats of ionizing radiation. When the containment team found them 3 days later, they discovered 2 bodies in advanced stages of radiation poisoning. Their skin sloughed off, their internal organs liquefied. The dosimeters read 12,000 microsieverts, lethal doses, far beyond what any human could survive. But what puzzled the investigators was the camera. It was still recording, its battery somehow maintaining charge despite the radiation that should have fried its circuits. The footage showed static, grain, and darkness. But in the final frames, enhanced and analyzed by Foundation technicians, something was visible. 2 new shadows, burned into the trees where the bodies were found. 2 human silhouettes captured mid-scream, their mouths open, their arms raised. And in the background, barely visible through the grain, a 3rd shadow, taller, thinner, walking away into the forest. The Foundation containment report, designated SCP-3802, described the entity as an ambulatory radiation anomaly with consciousness-affecting properties. It absorbed background radiation in a sphere approximately 50 meters in radius, then released it in concentrated bursts when in proximity to living subjects. The flash shadows were not thermal impressions, but some form of permanent information transfer, capturing the final moments of victims' consciousness. The report noted that the shadows in Pripyat 9 were increasing in number. Not because new victims were entering the zone, but because the existing shadows were moving, spreading, multiplying. As if the entity was learning to reproduce itself, creating copies from the impressions it had taken. The containment team sealed the city more thoroughly, erected additional barriers, and reclassified the threat level. But they knew it was only a matter of time. The shadows were patient. They could wait, and eventually someone else would enter the zone. Someone else would see the crimson vegetation and the impossible silhouettes. Someone else would hear their Geiger counter fall silent and turn to find death standing directly behind them. The Foundation retrieved Alexei's camera and Victor's Geiger counter. Both were placed in secure storage, their data backed up and analyzed. The collector who had hired them was identified and administered Class A amnestics. The footage was classified. But sometimes late at night, Foundation researchers reviewing the files would notice something strange. The shadows in the archived photographs would be in different positions than they'd been in previous viewings. A hand moved, a head turned, a figure that had been standing was now kneeling. And in the most recent photographs, taken by remote drones monitoring the containment zone, a new shadow had appeared on the wall near the perimeter fence. 2 figures standing side by side, their Geiger counters hanging from their necks. Victor and Alexei captured forever in the moment before they understood what was happening to them. Their shadows were facing inward toward the city center, toward the facility, toward whatever still waited in Containment Room 7, glowing with its faint blue light. And every day, imperceptibly, those shadows moved a little closer to the edge of the containment zone, a centimeter, a millimeter. Patient as radiation itself, constant as decay, moving toward the boundary between the dead city and the living world beyond. The Foundation maintained its watch. They monitored the radiation levels, tracked the shadows, and ensured that no one else entered Pripyat 9. But they knew, with the certainty that comes from studying the anomalous for decades, that containment was only temporary. The shadows were moving. The entity was learning, and one day, perhaps soon, perhaps in 100 years, the containment would fail. And then the shadows would spread beyond the walls, into the forests, into the towns, into the cities. Everywhere there was radiation, everywhere there was decay, the shadows would follow, silent, patient, waiting for the moment when the Geiger counters would fall silent and the metallic taste would fill your mouth and you would turn to find death standing directly behind you. But that day had not yet come. For now, the walls held, the containment was secure, and in the archives of the SCP Foundation, in a secure server buried beneath hundreds of meters of concrete and steel, a video file played on an endless loop. Two men running through a dying city, a shadow following behind them, and the sound of Geiger counters clicking, 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 marking the rhythm of their final hours. The file was labeled SCP-3802, Geiger log, initial discovery, and beneath that in smaller text, containment status pending.